If you're a man somewhere in your late 20s or 30s and you've noticed yourself going quieter, not louder, there's something in this video that was written specifically for you. Not because you're broken, but because what's happening inside you is far more complicated than anyone around you seems to understand. There's a moment most men reach, usually somewhere around 30, where they just stop explaining themselves. Not because they finally won, not because life got easier, but because they've done the math. They've calculated the cost of being misunderstood one more time, and the numbers don't add up anymore. And what looks like strength from the outside, that composure, that quiet, is often just a very controlled form of grief. We're going to go somewhere most videos about silence don't go, because most of what you've seen on this topic is motivational packaging. Win quietly, let your success make the noise. And honestly, that's comfortable, it's flattering, but it doesn't tell you why you actually vanish. It doesn't tell you what's really happening in the brain of a man who goes silent. And it doesn't tell you the cost, the very real, very heavy cost of mistaking armor for wisdom. So here's the thread we're going to pull on. There's a reason the same man who reads Marcus Aurelius before bed is also the one who hasn't told anyone how he actually feels in years. And that reason sits at the intersection of three things: Stoic philosophy, attachment theory, and the psychology of male withdrawal. By the end of this, you'll understand not just why smart men go silent, but whether the silence is serving them or slowly consuming them. Let's start with the philosophy, because it's been misread on a massive scale. Stoicism, the real thing, the ancient Greco-Roman tradition, was never about not feeling. Marcus Aurelius wept. Seneca wrote about grief with a tenderness that would embarrass most modern men. The actual Stoic concept is called apatheia, and it doesn't mean apathy. It means freedom from destructive passion, the ability to feel an emotion fully, acknowledge it clearly, and then choose how you respond, rather than letting the emotion drive the car. That's a profound distinction. Feel it, but don't be controlled by it. Acknowledge it, but don't perform it. The Stoics weren't building walls, they were building filters. But somewhere between ancient Rome and the modern man's morning routine, something got lost in translation. The philosophy got flattened into a slogan, and the slogan became, "Don't feel, handle it yourself, never let them see you struggle." Which sounds like discipline, but it's actually just suppression wearing a toga. A professor of mental health, Nafis Alam, noted in May 2026 that one of the most significant risks of modern Stoicism is exactly this: its misinterpretation as emotional suppression. And that misinterpretation doesn't just leave men lonely. It actively discourages them from seeking help when they need it most. So we have an entire generation of men who think they're practicing philosophy when they're actually practicing avoidance. And the difference between those two things is everything. Now here's where it gets deeper. Because the misreading of Stoicism doesn't happen in a vacuum. It lands on top of something that was already there. Something built long before a man ever picked up a philosophy book. It was built in childhood, and it's called attachment style. Attachment theory, originally developed by John Bowlby, describes how our earliest experiences with caregivers shape the way we relate to other people for the rest of our lives. not as a metaphor, as a literal neurological blueprint. There are several attachment styles, but the one that matters most for this conversation is the avoidant attachment style, and it develops in a very specific way. When a child's emotional needs are consistently met with distance, a parent who was physically present but emotionally unavailable or inconsistent, or who responded to vulnerability with dismissal, the child's nervous system learns something. It learns that needing people is dangerous, that closeness leads to disappointment, and so it adapts. It becomes fiercely, almost aggressively self-reliant. That child grows up, and he becomes the man who doesn't ask for help, the man who says, "I'm fine," when he isn't, the man who fills his schedule, work, the gym, headphones in, not because he's busy, but because being busy means he doesn't have to sit with the discomfort of needing someone. And here's what's important to understand. He's not doing this consciously. He's not being cold on purpose. His nervous system is running a survival program that was written decades ago in a house he no longer lives in. A November 2025 study by attachment researcher Philip Shaver found something remarkable. When dismissive avoidant individuals were asked to suppress negative emotions and thoughts, brain scans showed greater activation in the frontal control regions, the parts of the brain responsible for regulation and override. In plain English, their brains are literally more practiced at flipping an emotional kill switch. This isn't weakness, it's a highly developed skill. The problem is that a skill built for survival in childhood can become a prison in adulthood.
So now we have a man with an avoidant attachment blueprint, someone who learned that emotional need is a liability, and we hand him Stoic philosophy. And in the wrong hands, or the unexamined hands, those two things don't create wisdom, they create a very convincing disguise. The avoidant man finds in Stoicism a philosophical justification for what he was already doing. I'm not shutting you out, I'm practicing detachment. I'm not afraid of intimacy, I'm just self-sufficient. The philosophy becomes the armor, and the armor becomes the cage. Carl Jung called this the persona, the mask we construct to face the world. And Jung was very clear about something. The persona isn't the problem. We all need one. The problem is when a man forgets that the mask is a mask, when the persona becomes so total, so practiced, so rewarded by the world around him, that he loses access to what's underneath. Jung called what's underneath the shadow, and the shadow doesn't disappear just because you stop looking at it. It just gets louder in the dark. Think about what this looks like in a real relationship. A man with avoidant attachment genuinely wants connection. This is the part that gets misunderstood. He's not indifferent. He's not a sociopath. He wants to be close. But as closeness increases, something in his nervous system starts sending alarm signals, because closeness means vulnerability, and vulnerability, somewhere in the oldest part of his brain, is registered as threat. So he starts to pull back, shorter responses, more time at work, a kind of ambient distance that his partner can feel but can't name. And then comes the push-pull dynamic, one of the most painful patterns in human relationships. The partner reaches out, seeking reassurance, seeking closeness. The avoidant man, feeling the pressure of that need, withdraws further. The partner, feeling the withdrawal, reaches out more urgently, and the man disappears deeper.
Neither of them is the villain. Both of them are running programs they didn't write. But the damage accumulates, and the silence, which started as protection, becomes a wall neither of them knows how to climb. Research from 2025 confirms that avoidant attachment is strongly associated with lower relationship satisfaction, not just for the avoidant partner, but for both people in the relationship. And there's a specific emotional trigger that accelerates the withdrawal: shame. Men with avoidant attachment often experience intense shame when they feel unable to meet a partner's emotional needs. And rather than sitting with that shame, which would require the very vulnerability they've been trained to avoid, they retreat. The silence isn't indifference, it's shame management.
Now let's talk about what this costs. Because there's a version of this story that gets told as strength. The lone wolf, the silent achiever, the man who needs no one. And from a distance, it can look like that. But the data tells a different story. A May 2025 systematic review, drawing on research involving nearly 14,000 Australian men, found that adherence to masculine norms of emotional suppression and stoicism dramatically increased the risk of suicidal behavior. Not marginally, dramatically. And, as of late 2025, studies show that only 1 in 3 men feel comfortable discussing their feelings with anyone. 1 in 3. And 75% of suicides in the United States are committed by men. These aren't abstract statistics. They're the end point of a very long road that begins with a small decision. The decision to stop explaining yourself, to handle it alone, to go quiet rather than be misunderstood one more time. The silence that feels like control is sometimes the first step toward a very dark place. I want to pause here because this is the part that most videos skip. They'll give you the dark statistics and then pivot immediately to solutions. Here are 5 ways to open up. And that pivot is too fast. It doesn't honor what it actually feels like to be a man who has spent years, maybe decades, building a self that doesn't need anyone. You can't dismantle that in a 5-step list. And honestly, you shouldn't try to. Because the silence isn't all wrong. Some of it is real. Some of it is earned. And that's worth sitting with. Because here's the thing about strategic silence. The real kind, not the avoidant kind. There is genuine wisdom in learning when not to speak. There is genuine power in not reacting to every provocation. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." It's not suppression, it's discernment. The ability to choose your response rather than be hijacked by your reaction. That's one of the most sophisticated things a human being can develop. So the question isn't whether silence has value. It does. The question is, which silence are you living? There's the silence of a man who has genuinely processed something and chosen not to perform his emotions for an audience. And there's the silence of a man who hasn't processed anything, who has simply buried it so deep that he stopped feeling it. One of those silences is stoic. The other is a Jung described a concept he called individuation, the lifelong process of integrating the different parts of the self into a coherent whole. And he was very specific about what blocks it. What blocks it is the refusal to look at the shadow. The parts of yourself you've deemed unacceptable. The need, The fear, the grief, the longing don't disappear when you refuse to acknowledge them. They go underground, and they start running your life from below the surface in ways you can't see and can't control. This is why the man who prides himself on needing no one often finds himself in a very specific kind of loneliness. Not the loneliness of isolation, but the loneliness of being surrounded by people who don't actually know him. He's present, he's functional, he might even be successful by every external measure, but there's a glass wall between him and everyone else, and he built it, and he doesn't remember when he stopped noticing it was there. There's a term researchers use for what happens when avoidant attachment meets the Stoic ideal: pseudo-stoicism. It looks like emotional regulation. It presents as self-mastery. But underneath, it's something closer to emotional shutdown, a system that's learned to run cold because warmth once led to pain. And the cruel irony is that the very thing these men are protecting themselves from, rejection, disappointment, the vulnerability of being truly known, is exactly what they're guaranteeing by staying behind the wall. So what does the path forward actually look like? Not the motivational poster version, the real one. It starts with a distinction that sounds simple, but is genuinely difficult to make in practice. The difference between choosing silence and defaulting to it. Chosen silence is conscious. It comes from a place of inner fullness. You've felt the thing, you've processed it, and you've decided that speaking it doesn't serve the moment. Default silence is automatic. It's the system taking over before you've even had a chance to decide. Learning to tell the difference requires something most avoidant men find deeply uncomfortable: slowing down enough to actually feel what's happening before the system shuts it down. That frontal lobe kill switch that Shaver's research identified, it's fast. It activates before conscious awareness catches up. Which means the work isn't just psychological, it's almost physical. It's learning to notice the moment your body starts to close, the tightening in the chest, the urge to deflect, the sudden need to be somewhere else, and to pause there, just for a breath, before the wall goes up. And here's what the research actually shows about what helps. A 2025 survey by the National Institute of Mental Health found that men who participated in peer support programs, men talking to other men in structured, honest settings, reported a 50% increase in feelings of social connectedness and a significant decrease in depressive symptoms. Not therapy in the clinical sense necessarily, just men being honest with other men, which turns out to be one of the most radical acts available to the modern male. Because the cultural script for men is still, in 2026, deeply suspicious of that kind of openness. The man who admits he's struggling is still, in too many rooms, seen as the man who couldn't handle it. And so men perform the handling. They perform the composure. And the performance is so convincing that eventually even they believe it. Until something cracks. A relationship ending, a health scare, a quiet Tuesday night where the weight of the accumulated silence becomes suddenly unbearably heavy. Krishnamurti said something that I keep returning to. He said, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And I think about that in the context of male emotional suppression.
The man who never cries, never asks for help, never admits uncertainty. He's not well. He's well adjusted. Those are very different things. And a culture that rewards the adjustment while punishing the health is a culture that's quietly consuming its men from the inside. The authentic Stoic tradition, the one Marcus Aurelius actually practiced, understood this. In his meditations, he didn't write a victory journal. He wrote a document of ongoing struggle, of self-doubt, of the gap between who he wanted to be and who he sometimes was. He wrote it for himself, in private, with no audience. And what comes through on every page is not the absence of feeling. It's the presence of a man genuinely wrestling with his own humanity. That's not suppression. That's the most honest form of self-examination there is. So if you're a man who has been going quieter, who has been pulling back, filling the schedule, letting the responses get shorter, I want to ask you something, not as a challenge, as a genuine question. What are you protecting? Because there's something underneath the silence. There always is. And the question isn't whether it deserves protection. The question is whether the protection has become the problem. Whether the wall that once kept you safe is now keeping you just safe. Just that. Nothing more.
Real Stoic detachment, the kind that actually serves you, isn't about needing less. It's about being less controlled by the fear of needing. There's a difference between a man who doesn't need approval because he's genuinely grounded in his own values, and a man who doesn't seek approval because he's terrified of what happens if he asks and the answer is no. One of those men is free. The other is just very, very good at pretending. Alan Watts talked about the difference between genuine security and the performance of security. He said that a man who is truly secure doesn't need to demonstrate his security. He doesn't need to prove he's unaffected, unmoved, untouchable. The need to prove those things is itself evidence of their absence. And I think about how many men I've known, how many men you've known, who wore their detachment like a badge, who made a point of not needing, who treated their own emotional unavailability as a kind of achievement. Here's where I want to land, because this isn't a video about tearing down the men who go quiet. It's about understanding them, maybe understanding yourself. The man who vanishes, who goes silent, who retreats, who handles it alone, he's not broken, he's adaptive. He built something that worked once. The question is just whether it still works, whether the strategy that protected a 10-year-old boy is still the right strategy for the man he's become, and whether the grief underneath the composure has ever been allowed to breathe. The one thing I'd ask you to carry from this video, just one, is this. Notice the next time you go quiet, and ask yourself which kind of silence it is. Is it the silence of a man who has genuinely chosen stillness? Or is it the silence of a man who's running? You don't have to answer out loud. You don't have to tell anyone. But answer it honestly, to yourself, in the private space where no one else is watching. Because that private honesty, that willingness to look at your own shadow without flinching, that is what Marcus Aurelius was actually doing. That is the real practice. In the next video in this series, we go deeper into the attachment wound itself. Specifically, what it looks like when a man with avoidant attachment begins for the first time to let someone in. What that process actually feels like from the inside. Because it's not what you'd expect.
and understanding it might be the most useful thing you encounter this year. Until then, sit with the silence. Just know what it is.